Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Ha'ay rab tawab la'atham, za achyakam yawam chagadaw Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the JMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kayam lakathashamayim kwa rab, repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call halayim la la, but now Yahweh bahasham Yahweh shai, bahasham rochak wadashwa mashana. Laza Konim Nawa Wamala Akim Shara Chagadar, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists. Bahasham, and the name Yahweh Shai delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is Psalms chapter 1 and verse 1. All right, in the subtitle it says, The righteous and the wicked contrasted. And it says, Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doeth he meditate day and night. All right, and ultimately it's going to be the elect man is going to be blessed. All right, because the elect man. All right, and those of the elect are ultimately not going to have walked in the conversation of those that are wicked. All right, and what that entails of the ways of this world. All right, that's adverse to the scriptures. So ultimately, the elect are ultimately going to be in a very blessed state. I'm gonna get this word for blessing. It says ashar, and it says happiness. It says happy. All right, and ultimately when we go into the scriptures, I'll get this real fast. This is 2nd Esdras chapter 8, and we'll get verse 52. And it says, "For unto you is paradise open, the tree of life is planted, the time to come is prepared. Plenteousness is made ready, a city is builded, and rest is allowed. Yeah, perfect goodness and wisdom." All right, and ultimately on this side, all right, that's not allotted. All right, so when we go into this word for blessed, all right, ultimately it's manifold, it's multifaceted. All right, but just going into that, the elect are ultimately going to have abundance, in the kingdom. All right, because on this side, Jake is under the curses. All right, and some of those curses, entail of, scriptures like Deuteronomy 28 and 37, and going into, those being called those bywords. All right, but what comes with those bywords ultimately comes a expectation, from Esau. All right, and those bywords ultimately come with a certain culture. All right, and ultimately it's the elect that are going to walk away from those types of lifestyles and the things that would have been given unto Jake as a culture. All right, because our culture really goes back to the scriptures. All right, and the scriptures is ultimately, how we're able to thrive. All right, whereas those that walk in the counsel of the ungodly and sit at the seat of the scornful, and pretty much going into this verse, those that are ultimately in the way of sinners are going to have subscribed to nigga culture, all right, Hispanic culture, all right, Mexican culture, so on and so forth. All right, but let's get a couple precepts. Let's get Micah chapter 2, and we'll get verse 10. And it says, "Arise ye and depart, for this is not your rest, because it is polluted. It shall destroy you, even with the sore destruction." All right, so arise ye and depart. How this is done is by subscribing to the scriptures. All right, it says, "Arise ye and depart, for this is not your rest." Ultimately by subscribing to the scriptures, we depart spiritually. All right, because staying in this place spiritually and physically, it's not gonna do any good. All right, because if one was to ultimately stay in the mindset of America, as it says right here, they will essentially reap destruction. So reading it back, Micah chapter 2 and verse 10, "Arise ye and depart spiritually, for this is not your rest, because it is polluted. It shall destroy you, even with the sore destruction." And as the scriptures go into, though hand join in hand, the wicked shall not go unpunished. All right, so the Jake that don't want to repent from this society, all right, which consists of 2/3, essentially they're going to be destroyed, you see, because they didn't want to choose the way that was going to be most beneficial for them. They chose the way that ultimately was going to, that they felt comfortable, or whatever their reasoning was. All right, ultimately 2/3 is destined for destruction, you see, because they chose the ways that reap of destruction. All right, so let's also we'll get 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15. All right, and it says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. All right, in which it says right here in the subtitle, do not love the world. You see, because that's what it consists of, as we got in Psalms, the first chapter and the first verse. All right, that consists of, the way of sinners, all right, and the seat of the scornful, and then the counsel of the ungodly is the ways of the world, and the ways of the world consist of, you know, essentially the rudiments and the rudimentary level that Esau ultimately pushes as a lifestyle, i.e., getting money, all right, having degrees, all right, putting the woman before the man, things that ultimately worldly people confide in. All right, that's the love of the world. All right, so it says, reading it back, it says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world, because you got Jake that's ultimately after materialistic things. All right, they're not looking after the spiritual things. It says, if any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him, so those that's going to take the way of the sinners, ultimately, the Lord isn't really dwelling with them. All right, because ultimately the elect is going to have had, repented, and went into the way of the Spirit. All right, as pursuant to this scripture right here, John 6:63. All right, because the way of the world ultimately it is carnal, it's of the flesh. All right, John 6:63, it says, it is the Spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. Now going back to Micah chapter 2 and verse 10, it said, arise ye and depart, for this is not your rest, because it is polluted. It shall destroy you even with the sword destruction. So those that essentially subscribe to the ways of this world, are the ways of, the ungodly, ultimately they're seeking after something that's not going to profit. All right, they're chasing vanity. All right, that's why it says it is the Spirit that quickeneth, because those ways, they don't quicken, they don't bring back to life, they don't restore back to life. All right, it's this word that restores us. All right, and those that ultimately subscribe to this word are going to truly be blessed. First go around in the kingdom. All right, so let's go back to Psalms chapter 1 and read verse 1 again. It says, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. All right, because ultimately, as pursuant to Psalms, the 28th chapter, all right, the Lord is going to reward a man according to his works. All right, the word for just deserts, all right, just deserts goes into, a recompense. I've been reading this back and then we'll get that. But this is Psalms 1:1. It says, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doeth he meditate day and night. All right, then let's get this. This is Psalm chapter 28, and we'll get verse 3. All right, and it says, draw me not away with the wicked, and with the workers of iniquity, which speak peace to their neighbors, but mischief is in their hearts. Give them according to their deeds, and according to the wickedness of their endeavors. Give them after the work of their hands. Render to them their desert. All right, and whether a man has been working righteousness or wickedness, both are going to receive of a recompense. All right, if a man has been working righteousness, that man's gonna receive of a righteous reward. All right, but on the contrary, if that man has been working, man or woman, is going to receive of if they have been working wickedness, they're going to receive of destruction. All right, being that they're in that mindset. All right, because 2/3 just by default, they're going to subscribe to the ways of captivity, and they're going to reap up destruction. All right, so let's get a couple more, and that'll be it. But this is Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 1. All right, because this illustrates, how to rise ye and depart. All right, this is Isaiah 52 and 1, and it says, awake, awake, put on thy strength, O Zion, put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For henceforth there shall no more come into thee the uncircumcised and the unclean. Excuse me. All right, and it said arise ye and depart. All right, that's synonymous with awake, awake. You see, because Jake in the world ultimately is asleep. All right, so reading it again, awake, awake, put on thy strength. All right, because with Jake being at that lower state, all right, again, that came with a certain vibration. All right, that came with the vibration of not understanding, not knowing, not understanding, who we are as a people, for 2/3. That essentially shows that's ultimately a weakness. All right. But here it is in verse 1 again, Isaiah 52 and 1, where it says, awake, awake, put on thy strength. The Lord told us what to do. It's just that 2/3 want to subscribe, to ignorance. It says, put on thy strength, O Zion, put on thy beautiful garments. All right, so it's this word that ultimately beautifies us. It says, "O Jerusalem, the holy city, for henceforth there shall no more come into thee the uncircumcised and the unclean," in which the fulfillment of this in totality is going to be in the kingdom, you see. But it starts on this side with this truth by the rehearsal of the righteous acts. That's ultimately how woman, the Israelite man and woman ultimately cleanses ourselves. That's the word is what cleanses us. All right. Psalms 119 and verse 9, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way by taking heed thereto according to thy word. And that's also synonymous with being awake, and that's also synonymous with rising, yea, and departing. All right. So let's also get this. This is Proverbs chapter 1. We'll get verse 32. All right. And it says, verse 31, it says, therefore, I start at verse 28. All right. Proverbs 1 and 28. Then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. All right. Those that are essentially, that was listed in verse 1, those sinners. All right, the ungodly, ultimately, they're going to be calling upon the Lord, but the Lord isn't going to answer. It says they shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. For they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would none of my counsel. They despise all my reproof. Therefore shall they eat of the fruit of their own way and be filled with their own devices. For the turning away of the simple shall slay them, and the prosperity of fools shall destroy them. So being that 2/3 wanted to turn away from this wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, that's ultimately what's going to be to their detriment. It says, "In the prosperity of fools shall destroy them." And that word for prosperity goes into a sense of security, whether it be genuine or false. All right, the elect are going to subscribe to that genuine sense of security, while 2/3 ultimately subscribe to that false sense of security. All right. And that's why it says the prosperity of fools shall destroy them, because it seems prosperous for a fool to be into foolishness, you see, but they don't ultimately consider they're gonna be destroyed for that. All right. So let's go back to this Psalms chapter 1 and verse 1 or verse 2, and I'm gonna close. But this is Psalms 1 and 2. It says, "But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doeth he meditate day and night." All right. And ultimately, that's why the scriptures say, "And wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of thy times, and strength of salvation. The fear of the Lord is his treasure," because it shows true stability. Whereas, those in the world in these times, they don't know whether they're going to the right or to the left. All right. But, the hopeful elect ultimately have that stability that comes with the scriptures, you see, because this truth ultimately provides for true stability. We have a more sure word of prophecy, so I just want to go into that. Adoran Tazaza Banaya Palos, with us a beautiful edification to the spirit. Wadoran Tazah. Atham Yesh Leila Tawab, Lord's will. You have a good night. Wa shalom lakam, which is peace into you all. Shalom, shalom.